Now let's build out our pop method. I'm going to bring up a singly linked list here. And if you'll recall, with a singly linked list, to pop an item off the end, it was an O of N operation. Because in order to move tail over to here, we had to start at head and iterate through the entire list until we got to this point and then we could set tail equal to this node. But because all the arrows pointed forward, we had to do that entire process of iterating through the list. But with a doubly linked list, this is different because we do have arrows pointing backwards. So what we can do is this. We know that since we're going to pop that off, we're going to have a temp variable pointing to that last item and return that. So I'm just going to bring that up here. Now instead of having to iterate through the list to have tail go back one item, we can just say tail is equal to tail.previous and move that right over. Once that's moved over, we can say tail.next, we'll set that equal to null, and then temp.previous, we can set that equal to null, and that pops that off the end of the list. And then we just return temp, like that. But one of the things that is similar between a doubly linked list and a singly linked list is that we have an edge case if there is only one item. We're going to have to write some code for that. And then, of course, if there are no items, you cannot pop an item off the end of the list. If you want to give this a shot, go ahead and pause the video here. Otherwise, I'm going to get into the code. So the first thing we're going to code for is if we have an empty linked list. So we can do that like this. And this is the way we've done it before. But we could also say if tail is null. We could also say that the length equals 0. This is the one I'm going to use here. And we're going to return undefined. So let's bring up our doubly linked list here. We need to create our variable. So we'll say let temp equal this dot tail, like that. And in order to move the tail over, we can say this dot tail equals this dot tail dot previous. And that moves that over. Tail.next equals null. Tail.next equals null, and that breaks that off from there. And temp.previous equals null. So temp.previous equals null. Then we just need to decrement the length by 1. Okay, so let's look at this in with the rest of our code. Looks good so far. We need to also write the code for when we have only one item. So if you'll recall, it looked like this in a singly linked list. It would be the same here. And if this looks unfamiliar to you, we went over this in detail in the pop method of the linked list. And remember that this is 0 after we have decremented the length. So this applies to when we had 1, we decremented the length, and the length became 0. Then we just need to return temp. So I'm going to do something different with this code. And the reason is this could be a little confusing when you're reading it, because you have if this dot length equals 0 here, and then we have if this length equals 0 here. Now granted, this one happens after we decrement the length, but it still may not be easy to read. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this whole if statement here, and I'm going to move it up above where we decrement the length. Now, I'm going to remove some lines of code here. I'm going to remove 5 lines, and I'm going to bring them all back here in a second. I'm just going to rearrange the code. So I'm going to take these 5 lines out. They're all coming back in a second. So this if statement is for when we have one item in the list. So I'm going to change that 0 to a 1 when I move it up here. So we have if statements for when there are 0 items or 1 item, or we could say else there's 2 or more items. We can bring these lines of code back in for when there are 2 or more items, and then decrement the length and return temp. So all I've done here is rearrange the code to make it easier to read. When we wrote this the first time in the linked list section, I did that in a particular order so I could explain the concepts in the order that I wanted to explain them. But a lot of times, as you are figuring out how to code something, you will get to the end of it like we did here and go, that's not that readable. Maybe this could be done in a different way. So I just wanted to show that here, that we can move this stuff around and still have this work the same way. Now it's much easier to read from top to bottom. We could say if there's 0 items, do this. If there's 1 item, do this. Else 2 or more items, do this. So now I'm going to put the code back to the way it was and just watch how everything moves here. It's the same code. And then I'm going to move it back. The only thing that I've added here is an else. Other than that, it's all the same code. So we'll look at this code in a moment in DevTools. And when we do, we're going to start with a linked list that looks like this. We want to make sure our pop method works with 2 or more items. And then we'll pop an item off, and we'll see if it works with 1 item. Pop that off. And then we'll see if it works with no items. And this is where we would expect this to return undefined. Okay, so let's flip over to DevTools. Okay, so there is our pop method. And this is where we build the linked list with 1 and 2. So let's zoom out here. We'll run this. And just have a look at this linked list. We have value of 1 and 2. I'm going to clear this. And I'm going to run pop. That returns the value of 2. And if we say my doubly linked list, you can see the length is now 1. I'm going to clear this. We'll run pop again. And it returns the node with the value of 1. If we look at my doubly linked list, you can see the length is 0. I'm going to clear this and run pop one more time. And it returns undefined. Okay, so that is our method for pop.